Well, good day, folks. We're going to talk really briefly a little bit about organizational change management and why we would even talk about that from that perspective. And if you look at what Dan and Jason had talked about in terms of those kind of 9 top projects that JD Edwards are working on, that folks are taking, customers are taking, upgrades, reducing modules, process improvements, integrations, dealing with acquisitions, rollouts, etc. Really, all those point to an organization also needing to be change agile. Even though things kind of stay the same, nothing stays static. And so that becomes a key component for us as far as also driving the change. So even smaller changes, and I'll contend that even an upgrade may be more difficult than a net new change, because you're asking people to take a process that's quite similar or a knowledge base in terms of a system quite similar and making smaller adjustments to it in improvements. And sometimes that's harder to get that habitual operating to change. So it's important to kind of take a look at the change and change management as a component as you start continue to improve your systems and your processes and your business operations. So we'll touch a little bit on OCM on that. One of the problems with a lot of projects and a lot of organizations is that folks tend to manage risk, in a rearview mirror, so to speak, and it's a tossing of the dice of, we'll kind of take care of that, or it'll take care of itself. And we contend that we need to be really purposeful with change and change management. So when you start looking at those constraint points on a project, oftentimes, we look at, there's hardware, software, technology, business processes. All those things work really well. The biggest wild card you got on any type of change is your people. Your people are your biggest wild card. And so if we don't address that side, and very specifically, you run risks in your project. And the key component there is that with OCM, you don't need to do sometimes a shotgun approach or a big piece. Is laser focusing your efforts on that to manage the change and effectively drive people to using that new system, that new process, the new way of doing business. So what is change management? We integrate it into our methodology, and it's a huge component of that for effective long-term sustainability. But it's really about the human side of that technology and business process. It's about supporting that. It's about understanding the change that's going to be implemented, incremental or large scale. Identifying those individuals that are going to have to change and supporting them, connecting them with the drivers that do that, and then creating very specific strategies and tasks and actions that will drive the adoption, the rapid end user adoption of that change on it. So it's not as simple as just doing project management and steroids. Clearly, it's not that, and it's clearly not the touchy-feely, just make everybody feel good about it. It is a distinct business decision to help you drive the success and the value you get out of your system and your business processes. So kind of my running joke, and I don't have very good jokes, but my background is clinical and organizational psychology. So I bring to the table with our change management processes not only the structure around OCM, but also around how do you get people to make that change, the people part of it that integrates in it. And I was working with a woman, I do also private practice counseling, and real sharp young woman, getting her PhD and wanted to be a high school principal. She started talking, she's saying, Tom, I talk about change, you talk about change. So in one sense, tell me what has changed. So like every good therapist who doesn't know what to say at the moment said, well, what do you think change is? And then I really got to the point of saying change is new information. It's a new mindset. It's a new way of doing things. But growth is the application of that information. And so when you think about the things that Dan and Jason talked about and what you're looking to continue to grow within your organization, the key piece is the change is that new set of processes, that new module, that new tweak to the system. but your success is going to be on how your folks apply that. And that really is the essence of OCM and why we look for that. So oftentimes the first starting point we look for is the difference between installation and realization. A lot of organizations just kind of stop at installation, that we're installing the system. We're just going to install a piece of that, the new processes, a new module, we're going to upgrade, and that should take care of it. And that's a huge component of what you're looking to do in your projects. And you can see the key players in that. Again, project governance, project management, your core functional teams, technology, and some OCM within that. But if you're looking for the realization is realizing those business values, the benefits, the long-term sustainability of what you're looking for. That's when you start going into the area where OCM becomes a big role in that, because it's looking at the people, your processes, the transformation. And so the bleeding over of your project governance, building out your change networks, your OCM plan are huge in that. The combined pieces of that installation and realization are the keys to long-term success for your projects on that. This is a model we like to kind of look at from a change cycle because every organization goes through that. It's a very, very familiar to a lot of you folks. And obviously it's based off of Kubler-Ross's work on that. But really what it looks like, everybody in the organization will go through this cycle. From the CEO down to the part-time receptionist filling in, everybody goes through that cycle. So what is change management? Change management is about compressing the time folks go through this process and mitigating, identifying those risks and mitigating those risks and managing the change prior to going live. So what happens is that each person and every part of your organization that has some change will go through this, and they'll start off, let's say you're going to roll out a new inventory management to one of your facilities, one of your plants. And they're the ones that are up front going, we need a structured system. We need this. Bring it on to us. We'll take it. Put us in front of the line. Why? Because they haven't got a clue what's going to happen to them, and it's 6 or 8 months out. So they get on board. Now you come to them 3-4 months before you're ready to go live with them and start to roll out to their organization. You knock on their door and they go, hold on a second. Can you put us to the back of the line? We're really busy. Why? Because now we get to this point where it's personal. It's hitting them. And every organization, every individual goes through this area of realistic concern. And that's where you find resistance. And resistance isn't a negative thing. It just is. We just need to know how to manage that, because we want to pull people up to that area where they're either going to accept or reject that change. And so we'll go through that process, the cycle, quite a few times with the people. The key two things I want you to pull out of this, remember that. First of all is that people and groups within your organization go through this at different time frames. So if you only look at one individual or one department and assess your whole organization from that, you're missing out. The other piece is that, at least in theory, the higher up you are from the organization, the quicker you go through this change, because the further removed you are from the actual day-to-day change. So, for example, if you have a CFO sits in a boardroom and says, three-way automated match, process our POs different, he or she's already on board. Thumbs up, we'll take it. They're already at that acceptance level, because how many POs do they process during the day? 0. But that individual who manages and processes POs 8 hours a day is going to take a little while to go through this change. So our methodology, and it fits really the whole project methodology, drives people through this cycle so that when we go live, we're already there processing. We've accepted that change and we're moving on, and that's a key piece. So the 7 pillars that we identified of successful change adoption really are these key components to making a project change work, and it fits right in with your project management, sponsorship, and leadership, which is key to any organization. Looking at communications, aligning your stakeholders, looking at change impact management, training, getting your local change networks for sustainability. These pillars, no matter what change you're doing, need to be identified at different levels, obviously, but those are key components you want to take a look at, and there are factors that fit within the methodology that we employ. What are some of the basic tenets of OCM? Using the ADKAR model, which is a very popular model and a really good standard for effectively across the board employee change, because it fits in with your communication, your training, your onboarding, etc. People need to go through this process. They need to go through awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. But don't think of them as you can pull out any module or any part of this interchangeably. They're really dominoes or toll gates. You got to knock one down before you go to the next one. So they get into this sense of awareness of why this is happening, what's going on. Folks need to understand of what's important, that there's a need for a change and understanding of that. They move into this desire of why it's happening, that I understand that connection between why there's an awareness for this change and what I need to do that. So once they get a desire for that piece, the alignment between how it's going to benefit me and benefit the organization, they bought into this. This is all the area of the buy-in. Then we get into knowledge, and that's about how it's going to impact a person and personally. They need to have a knowledge on how to make that change happen, the cognitive ability to make that change. And moving to the ability pieces of the performance, or proficiency. That's not just good enough to know how to make that change, but I got to be able to do that. Because remember, all our behaviors are habitual. And when you make a change, you're literally changing the culture of the organization. I had in fact, last week, I had an executive ask me, he says, we're not looking to change the culture at all. I said, well, maybe not the culture necessarily, but you're going to have cultural changes, because what is the culture for an organization, a project team, etc.? It's nothing more than an amalgamation of its behaviors. And if you're changing the behaviors, you are changing, in essence, parts of the culture. So be purposeful about it. And then finally, reinforcement. You have to be able to reinforce that change for it to sustain. So if you think about it from any perspective, where a lot of organizations oftentimes fail is they jump into the knowledge place and just start training people near the end of a project and haven't really addressed the awareness or desire. And then training falls apart on this. So in other words, what happens if we don't get those? In the absence of creating that awareness and desire, what we're going to see is a lot more resistance from employees, people kind of churning and cycling in that churn in the adoption or acceptance of that change, higher turnover from that change, a hoarding of resources because they're going to keep it onto themselves. You're going to see hanging on to tribal knowledge, and delays in the implementation. If we don't bang out the knowledge and ability, people aren't going to utilize the system or the processes, the new processes well, those tools. You're going to see a lower succession rate and adoption rate when you go live, and there's going to be a reduction in productivity. If we don't get that reinforcement, what will happen is people will revert back to old ways. They'll find workarounds, and unfortunately, you'll find eventually those workarounds become your standard operating processes. So we look to drive people through this process, this ADKAR model, in our change management methodology. So what are some of those roles, real quickly? You're going to want to have somebody who architects or leads that. That's really looking at what are the change management strategies that we need to do, and then leading that change plan. And that change plan, by the way, needs to be integrated into your project plan specifically. Don't have it as a bolt-on. It's part of the whole project management, the project governance. So that lead is going to be the quarterback in the business side. They're going to connect the business to technology and the people side for that triangle to work well. Communications is huge, so that's a big piece. You want somebody who's going to specialize in that communication or focus on comms, because that's really the changing the belief systems of people. And then finally, training, the training and onboarding. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Do you need individual roles for all those large-scale projects? You may, but oftentimes you can have an individual or individuals play small parts of those. The key point is you need to have someone kind of who owns each one of these areas, just like you would in any other type of your project plan. So how does that work? What's a framework? When we look at doing change effectively in organizations, Trillium, we look to address that at 4 levels. The enterprise level, which is across the whole organization. And that's really looking at specific change plans across it to help the organization become change agile and change ready. We need to implement that at the division or departmental level because changes across the department, especially cross-functional changes, are key. In each organization, your locations, etc., have different nuances to that change. And so we build out a change network, a local deployment network that becomes your long-term sustainability piece in that. At the project core process teams, remember those people who are building out that change, designing it, developing it, testing it, they need to go through that change process first. They become your change agents and ultimately your individuals. Each receiver needs to be accounted for and addressed for that change because that's where change happens at the individual level. So I wanted to take a look at a standard kind of project methodology, kind of the chevrons or the phases you go through a project, and show you kind of some of the areas where change management pops into that and some of the tasks or high-level pieces that fit within that. In the launch or the beginning side piece, where you start in the define stage, so to speak, we start looking at change management strategies. Start building out your strategy. Think about what needs to be changed. Be very articulate with that as you work with your sponsorships and get your PMO aligned. We start looking at developing your, solidifying your project governance. And this is a big piece. You want to be able to align your sponsorship, your project management, your change management all together. Those 3 key elements are, and balancing of that is going to be success across the board. Research and literature really shows that sponsorship and leadership is the #1 factor in success of any project. You want to onboard your people properly. You want to set up a project launch so you're literally pulling people in and understand fully clearly where you're directing them and their directives to implement this, and then make sure everything's aligned. We move into that initiate, which gets into a lot of the, out of the design and the define area. We start getting into kind of things like a risk and readiness assessment, which is really important, is looking at assessing the organization. We have a proprietary tool that's been standardized across the board for literally 25 years now that looks at the change capacity and structure of folks in 13 different areas. And what that really pulls out is it tells us really the how well the organization demonstrates the ability to effectively handle significant change and the level of actual alignment and stated alignment. It gets at the aspects of the organization that are going to make that change significant and allows us to laser focus our efforts so we're not shotgunning the approach across the board. And that's a big piece. So out of that comes your OCM plan. That's your change management plan. It gets integrated into your project plan. You start preparing your resources for that. You start building out your comms plan. And when that's a big piece, communication is probably one of the most key components in any type of change management across the board. So you're going to want to look at building out and you usually have 2 change or communications plans. They're integrated, but they're kind of separate in their focus. You have a project communication plan, which is really about reporting and keeping that core process team, your project teams aligned on the communications within that network, that internal core teams. And then you have your change communication plan, which really looks at changing the behaviors, the mindset, and a rapid adoption of your end users, the people who are going to have to receive that. And so you use a lot of different vehicles, emails, posters, portals and web pages, newsletters, video boards, team meetings, trainings, town halls, etc. Because you want to get at that place where you effectively communicate with your stakeholders and all who are impacted by that change, how that process is. So that's a big, big piece. I also really recommend early on starting to look and get your training plan put together. Again, you're not launching at the beginning, but you have to start looking at the end result because those core process team members are going to be your trainers going across the board, and that's a big piece. You want to get your impact management, change impact. So we've got a process that looks at 5 catchment areas that effectively gets at looking at what are those change impacts, the secondary and tertiary impacts, identifying them ahead of time, and we start mitigating and managing those changes before you go live, so you don't get T-boned with something you didn't see coming when you go live. During that kind of build or integration process, you're building out now your change network. With your change network, and you're getting your training development, you're getting the materials, your long-term sustainability, and that is a big piece. I use training as a term because people are familiar with that, but once we get into it, we're not talking about training, we're talking about onboarding. You are literally want to onboard your people to a new process, new technology, a new way of being. And that's different from just stand-up training. It's onboarding. So it means it's sustainable, because after you go live, you can have multiple go lives. Or when you acquire a new company, or open up a new facility, or you get new employees, somebody is going to have to onboard that person going forward. You're going to have to update those things. So we look very closely at making everything repeatable and scalable. Everything we do in our change management methodology with our customers is we hand it over in a toolkit to that organization, because the goal is to have the organization be more change agile when we're done. And everything we develop, tools, templates, methodology, are repeatable and scalable on that. We also want to look at is there any differences to performance measurements across the board. When we start getting into then that validate section, we're really looking at how we're going to roll that out, get our change network to roll it out to the local areas, whether it's department or facilities. And we start building out that change, that end user adoption. We start deploying that training on that. Again, communication goes across the board throughout the life cycle of the project. And we start looking at that end user customer and internal or external customer analysis. We want to make sure also, what are those impacts to your vendors, your customers as well on that. When we deploy and go live, there's a whole follow through of helping that. And that's really that last part of the AgCar model. That's that support. That's a reinforcement section. So we got that support and reinforcement to make sure that people are able to do their jobs when you go live. There needs to be any type of support along the way in real time to them. But more importantly then is, what's the follow through? What's the sustainability? So when you walk out, you got a sustainable model that goes long term, instead of then the system becoming the eventually the problem. So I know I kind of whipped through change management, and I'd be more than happy to walk through in more detail with folks as we, in detail about how that gets integrated into projects. But it's a key component to the extension and sustainability of your solutions long term.